Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we are covering Game 6 from the match of the century, 1972 World Chess Championship between Bobby Fischer and Buddy Spassky. In Game 5, Bobby Fischer battled back to even up the series. So coming into Game 6, Bobby Fischer has the white pieces, and he has leveled the playing field. Now, he has hinted to his team. Each player has a team behind them. Kind of your main point person is called your second, but they do have a couple people that they prepare for, different lines, different variations in those particular openings. And Bobby Fischer kind of hinted that I was going to play something different in Game 6. Now, that kind of leaked out, and Buddy Spassky's team had kind of even mentioned, hey, what if we see something different besides the common pawn to e4, which Bobby Fischer, he loved e4, played it more than anything else. Sometimes even talked bad about other openings. He just didn't play much of anything else. Buddy Spassky said, no big deal. I'm kind of prepared for it. I play all these other openings. And Bobby Fischer did exactly that. He started out with pawn to c4. We'd really only seen Bobby Fischer play this particular opening twice ever in competitive play. So pretty interesting from him in such a high competitive stage to come out and play something he's not as familiar with, pawn to c4, met with pawn to e6, and then knight f3, pawn at d5, transposing into the queen's gambit decline line with pawn to d4. And Bobby Fischer had been pretty adamant about the queen's gambit not being a particularly good line, and he had never played this in competitive play, so it's pretty interesting that he chose this even after the c4 to transpose into the queen's gambit decline line. But you can pretty much bet that he had something in store for Buddy Spassky if he wanted to go and play this. Knight f6, then knight c3, bishop e7, bishop g5 to get the bishop outside the pawn chain before pawn to e3, and then castle on the king side, and then pawn to e3. But Spassky decided to play the Tartakower defense, which is a particular line with pawn to h6, and then after bishop back here, h4, pawn to b6. And he's very familiar with this line. He's never lost this line in competitive play coming into the game, so he felt confident playing this. So you have one side of the board that's not really played this line in competitive play against one of the top players in the world champion at the moment, that has played this to perfection his entire career. So going to be pretty interesting. We do see some sacrifices starts here on d5. The bishop takes here on e7, queen takes, knight takes, and the pawn recaptures here. And the rook swing over here to c1, just attacking, controlling this semi-open file here on the c file. Bishop here to e6, and white has a few options here. We could see knight to e5. We could see bishop to d3, getting ready to castle on the king side. We could even see more of a quiet move from Bobby Fischer, pawn to h3. He decides to go for a more aggressive route, which makes me believe, which makes total sense, is he definitely prepared for this line. He plays queen to a4, and this is not a move that you typically make against someone that knows the defense very well unless you have a very particular game plan going forward. And you can tell that he does as this game continues. A pawn to c5, and then the queen back here to a3, just putting pressure on this c5 square. Rook over here, c8, bishop b5, and then pawn to a6. And this is pretty interesting. The second for Buddy Spassky was a fellow named Geller, and in 1970, so just a couple years ago, he played this exact same line, and he played queen to b7 and had great success with it. And so I'm not really sure if Geller didn't go over this particular line. I would imagine he would, or if for some reason Buddy Spassky forgot about it or just decided to maybe improve on it a little bit, but decided to play pawn to a6. I think queen to b7 is definitely worthy to take a look at. But after pawn to a6, we see the pawn take here on c5 and the pawn recapture. What's nice is this bishop's kind of hanging out here, but the pawn can't take it yet because then the queen's just going to sweep up here to a8 and take that rook right here. So it's just kind of toying with his opponent having this bishop here on b5. Now the castle on the king side, rook to a7. If you kind of ask me what I would do, just because I don't like Bobby Fischer having so much pressure on my side, I would play knight to c6, developing the center of the board. If he wants to take, that's fine. I can recapture with my rook right here, but it kind of blocks off some of what the white bishop here is doing. Also opens up the door. I can take with my pawn here, and then I have a defense with my rook here on c8. But decides to play rook here to a7. This does allow him to take with his pawn right now, since the queen would be able to protect this rook. So Bobby Fischer decides to go and bring his bishop back here to e2, and then knight to d7. Does need to activate it. Is not involved into the game yet, so d7 is the first spot. Bobby Fischer continues with knight to d4. Seems like another one of those moves where he's somewhat toying with his opponent, saying, you wish you could take my minor piece with your pawn, but you can't, because then I would just sweep up here and take your rook here on c8. Normal people like myself, I think you're just going to be playing rook here to d1. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think it's a strong move from Bobby Fischer. Control the center of the board. These two semi-open files with his rooks, that's going to be very good. All of his other pieces are fairly active, but decides to go and play knight here to d4, potentially just to mess with his opponent, but it is a very strong central square. Decides to go ahead and take the bishop off the board after the pawn recaptures. He now has a bishop, and his opponent has a knight. So he's going to try to limit all the squares that the knight can go to and really control the board with his bishop that's currently on e2. First, he's going to start out with pawn to e4, and this is a tricky spot for black because he would like to just take it right away, but he's going to have two isolated pawns right here that Bobby Fischer can attack the rest of the game. But if he doesn't take it, it gets pretty tricky as far as how he really plays with this pawn structure in the center of the board. I'll kind of show you that because he played pawn to d4. He just didn't like taking it. He wants to solidify his pawn chain a little bit more. But pawn to f4 first, making it very difficult for pawn to e5, which Buddy Spassky may want to play. First, we see queen to e7, but then pawn to e5 is very difficult. There is now a backward isolated pawn here on e6. It's no longer connected to these pawns right here, and it kind of blocks off a lot of the action for Buddy Spassky to bring his pieces over to the king side. And now Bobby Fischer is going to be aiming a lot of his pieces at this weakened king side and see if he can have a very, very strong attack. Rook here b8, attacking the pawn here on b2. Bishop up here to c4, starting to add pressure on this backward pawn. Isolated pawn here on e6. King here to h8, wants to make sure that it's not this pawn's not being pinned down. If for some reason the queen moves, just don't want to have any attack right there. So queen here to h8, then queen over here to h3. So if you kind of look at this board, you can see Bobby Fischer starting to really build an attack on the king side. It's going to be up to Buddy Spassky to find a way to defend against this. His knight right here is pretty much obsolete. It can't come here to e5, can't come here to f6, it's just going to fall on board. Can't come here to b8, that's not doing anything. b6 is going the opposite direction. He needs to be on the king side. f8 is probably his only and best move, but even there, it's not doing too much. It's just playing defense on the square on e6, but that just doesn't feel all that good. But as you kind of look at it, there's just not much else for him to do. So he plays knight to f8. If he looks at it and says, okay, let me take here with rook to b2, then all of a sudden the bishop takes here on e6. That's not very good. You can start to see things crumble. The pawns can start to push forward. This is going to be very tough for Buddy Spassky to hold on to. Maybe rook here to b7, but that still doesn't feel all that good. So in the game, he decides to go ahead and play queen here, h3, and then knight back here to f8. Bobby Fischer continues with pawn to b3, just solidifying his pawn chain a little bit on the queen side. Doesn't have to worry about the rook coming in, getting involved on the queen side of the board. Also allows just for this outpost here for the bishop. This bishop's not going anywhere. It's controlling a lot of the center of the board, which is nice. A pawn here to a5, starting to attack on the queen side, try to break up the side of the board with his rook as protection, but it's just too little too late. Bobby Fischer just goes for the jugular here. He realizes his opponent is on the ropes and he just pushes forward with all of his power, starting with pawn to f5, and this is just a strong attack. After the pawn takes, the rook's going to recapture here. Knight here to h7, but this knight's just going to be stuck for the rest of the game. It just can't do too much. Then rook over here f1, just lining up all the pieces. Queen here to d8. If we were to see something, you know, pawn to a4, then all of a sudden queen here to g3, we could see a capture here, but rook up here to f7. It gets very difficult as far as, you know, how black's actually going to come out of this. Queen and bishop versus knight and rook. Definitely not going to go well. Queen to d8 makes some sense, trying to just protect both sides of the board, but it's just very difficult right now to protect everything. Queen g3, a rook here to e7, starting to attack this pawn here on e5, but Bobby Fischer, he says, okay, that's fine. I have two pieces defending that right now, so I'm going to start to push forward with h4. This does limit some of the moves that black has. Can't come here to g5 anymore with his knight. So just slowly over time, putting more and more pressure on his opponent. Pawn here to e6. It is being protected by the bishop, so that's a nice little square. Rook here to c7. Queen e5. Queen e8. a4 pushing. He does have some other options. Doesn't have to play a4, but wants to go and just see what his opponent's going to be doing. He can easily just continue to put pressure, but a4 doesn't even have to worry about black playing a4 at any given time. Queen to d8, a rook up here to f2. Could have easily come to f4 even if he wanted to, just moving around a little bit. Queen e8, rook up to f3. Queen to d8, just kind of waiting for his opponent to make a mistake, but there's just no good moves that he has. So bishop to d3, queen e8, and then after queen to e4, but Spassky can probably just resign. There's just too much pressure going on. There's no way for him to really stop anything. Decides to play knight to f6. He can't really take with rook on e6. If we continue with here, rook up here, f8, check. The knight takes, the rook takes, the queen takes, and then all of a sudden it's checkmate. There's no way to stop that mating pattern. So we see knight f6, but then the rook takes. After the pawn takes, the rook takes here on f6. King here, g8, bishop c4, king back here, h8, and then queen to f4 in this particular spot. But Spassky resigned. Now, a lot of times people say, why did he resign? Well, if it's not super obvious, which it may not be, that's fine. We could see a continuation is a forced mating pattern. But let's say king to g8 if we wanted to. A rook over here taking. Let's say the rook takes. Queen up here, f6, getting ready for mate with rook here on h8. So trying to stop that. Bishop takes here on e6. Queen takes. Queen's going to recapture. And then all of a sudden we do see a mate shortly after that. And we could have a few variations of that, but all in all, there is no way after queen to f4 from stopping this. It is a mate, and I think it was around 11, depending on how long Spassky wanted to play it out. So afterwards, Bobby Fischer got an ovation from the audience, and Spassky actually clapped for him as well, gave him applause, and said this was an exceptional performance, not really playing the Queen's Game of Decline line and coming out and playing it perfectly, is for what Spassky said. And he knew this defense very well, and he said he just lost to a better player. So Bobby Fischer kind of showing the world that he could play with the best with their specialty, and he could still beat them. And so he does take a game advantage going into game number 7. Bobby Fischer played extremely good game, probably the best game we've seen in the series so far. He's really starting to be a little bit more aggressive even in his games. So thank you guys for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this video and the series so well, and I'll see you guys in the next one for game 7.